Hey guys, I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian on this episode of Rotten Reviews. On this episode, I'm going to take a look at the 2014 movie Godzilla. It has a 75% fresh on the tomato meter and a 66% on the audience score. Rotten Tomatoes considers that this movie is definitely not rotten. It is actually certified fresh. 319 critics in that score certifying this is fresh. 66% on the audience score. Well, that comes from over 176,000 audience reviews. This is, of course, a movie that was reviewed and released before Rotten Tomatoes implemented their newest audience review system, in which they have verified audience reviews and regular audience reviews. Verified reviews being reviews that it is said that Rotten Tomatoes can verify that a ticket was purchased by somebody to match that review. In the case of this movie, you don't have verified reviews, so it's just up to the people that create accounts and leave their reviews to be honest as to whether they've actually seen the film. And the reason I'm going on about this is because I just did a video about the new J.J. Abrams directed Star Wars movie, and there's quite a lot of controversy on that. Mostly about Rotten Tomatoes and the review system and whether it's accurate as far as audience reviews. We've had these controversies with other films, like back a while back in 2018 on Captain Marvel, for example. And I think that was 2018. I could be wrong. That might be 2019. I'm getting confused. I'm getting old. But in any case, now that this review system has been implemented, this verification system, you're going to see me talking about it more and more as we get into newer movies, because it's up to the people working behind the scenes as to whether or not this verification system is completely on the up and up. And so, you know, the conspiracy theorists are going to come in and do what they do. But for this movie, I'm just going to state that there should not be any verified reviews. And, you know, we're just going to get right into it. Now, a lot of people like me, the reason I say this is going to be a contrarian review is because a lot of people like myself, I can see from these reviews, I took a little sneak peek at them, a lot of people don't understand why this is actually not rotten, and I didn't understand at first either. I'm not sure I still understand why it's not rotten. In my opinion, it should be rotten because this movie commits the biggest sin that any work of entertainment can possibly commit, which is to be boring, and this film simply gets far too boring. It has a lot of action. Most of this action is packed towards the final act of the movie. And that's where actually this movie is the most boring. And so that's why I don't understand personally why this isn't rotten. We're going to explore that issue and see that maybe people are upvoting this because they're just fans of, you know, gaiju, of these Japanese monsters, more than they're really upvoting the movie for, you know, what you would base a movie critique on. But I'm just going by, you know, how I see this as a movie, and I see it as it's got too much boring footage, it's got too many logical plot fails, it's got characters and you know, characters that should know better in this setting, doing things that are illogical, that don't make sense for what their professions are. For example, it has scientists behaving like teenagers. But let's not divert too far into that before we get into the audience reviews. We have one from 12 hours ago, 4 stars, the best movie of Godzilla. Well, it might very well be the best Godzilla movie, judging on what we've had before, titled Godzilla, and other movies that aren't titled Godzilla, but they feature Godzilla. These stretch all the way back into the 60s. At least, and there are many of them that would just be flat out low budget B-C movies, completely rotten by today's standards, certainly. So this might actually be the best Godzilla movie. It might have the biggest budget, the best production value. It might have the most American names, big name actors attached to it. and it doesn't have a lot, but it may have many more than the prior Godzilla movies. And everybody knows about the 1998 Godzilla movie with Matthew Broderick, which is widely panned and widely considered rotten, and every other derogatory term that somebody can lump onto it. It takes quite a beating online, but this Godzilla is certainly better than that one, so I'll kind of agree. It has 4 stars on this review. Well, I'm going to say I think 2 stars might be fair. A peak of 2 stars on this movie because it just doesn't rise above mediocrity. Even when it's got believable action and it's got stuff going on that is somewhat compelling, there's just too much illogical stuff happening. Too many characters are doing things that aren't believable, and it's just the pace of the movie expects you to just not notice all of this. But let's continue. 1 star from One Day Ago. Boring, frustrating, poorly planned, and extremely insulting. Okay, I will say boring, I agree. Frustrating, well, I think it's frustrating because a lot of people, I've heard other people express their opinion that this is a monster movie, Godzilla and other monsters, and you just don't get a lot of those monsters. You get a lot of the movie. A lot of the movie's runtime is focused on some contrived drama between the human characters, and a lot of it's also boring. A lot of it doesn't make sense, and it just doesn't feel authentic. I mean, the actors are doing what they do. They're going through the motions. They're actually putting out pretty good performances. You have Aaron Taylor Johnson, Elizabeth Olsen, and Bryan Cranston, and a few others. They're all performing just fine. It's just that they're not convincing. Their drama between each other, their relationships, their family tension, it's just not believable. It feels too contrived and artificial, and that might be why people are saying this is frustrating, because they went into this looking to see a lot of monster battles, and a lot of the monster battles are at night, in shadow, in darkness, and after a while you can tell that this was a deliberate choice of the director to put most of the CGI monsters in very dark conditions, and even when they're outside fighting each other in daytime in the area around San Francisco, right at the Golden Gate Bridge, for example, all of a sudden it goes from a bright sunny day into a foggy, misty, very dark type of environment, and then it goes to nighttime very quickly, like it's daytime, and then just a few minutes later we're back into nighttime, full nighttime again. And that's just to, I think, deliberately keep these CGI monster creations in the darkness, to hide their flaws, to hide the fact that they knew that these things wouldn't be looked upon too favorably if they were, they had this bright sunlight shining on them throughout the whole movie, particularly in the parts when they're battling each other. They're always doing so in dark or dim conditions. There are a few shots of them in the daylight, but they're not battling each other. They're in solitary movements and whatnot. And so it was obvious to me, less than halfway through this, that they were keeping these things hidden in low lighting conditions. But let's move on. 4 stars 4 days ago. The kaiju action is exactly what I was expecting. There didn't need to be such a high focus on the human characters. Again, yes, this is where that frustration comes in. Somebody here is saying it's 3.5 stars. But they are complaining that there's too much of a focus on the drama between the humans. And I'll agree, because I don't think there's a problem with having the human drama, but this movie, a big flaw of it is that it opens 15 years earlier than the time in which the rest of the movie is set. The only thing I can say is at least they didn't do this in a flashback way. They just simply opened the movie in, I believe it's 1998. And 98 or 99, that's where the movie starts out. And then this movie kind of drags you into this setting in 98 or 99 with Bryan Cranston and his wife, and they're working at this Japanese power plant, and you're invested in these characters, and Bryan Cranston's wife is killed, and he is not. He goes on to survive and go through the rest of the movie, most of it. But you're invested in this time period. You're in your setting. You're in 98 or 99, and you're invested in what's going on. And the movie does a pretty good job of keeping you your interest invested in it. And then all of a sudden, boom! After the opening disaster scene at the nuclear power plant, it says, what does it say? Letters come across the screen and they say 15 years later. And then you're with Bryan Cranston's son, who is in the United States, and he's on leave from the military, I guess, at the time, and he's getting out of bed. And you're 15 years later, and Bryan Cranston's little son that was in the opening scene is now, a 21, 22-year-old or whatnot grown man. And you're just like, wow, why did the movie do that? It just like made me invest in that. And then all of a sudden, wow, I'm 15 years later with somebody I don't know. What's the point? And there really wasn't a point. It's just a way for the movie to put this contrived drama in at the beginning so that they can use it to do some more contrived drama further on in the movie. But it's really pointless. This has a runtime of 2 hours and 18 minutes, and they could have cut 10 minutes out just by getting rid of that 15 years ago scene. They could have done something similar and just put it in the actual modern setting of the film. But no, it kind of, in my opinion, it kind of wasted a lot of running time and our emotional investment. It wasted a lot of that too, right up front. Again, it could have been worse. It could have been just a big flashback or two dumped into the middle of the movie. That would certainly be worse. Let's move on. I'm going to try to focus on only 3-star and below reviews. That's why I'm calling this a contrarian episode of Rotten Reviews, because I don't think a lot of these 4- and 5-star reviews are going to tell me or teach me much. I think I'm going to get a lot more information out of those 3-star and belows. So let's start with this 2.5-star review from 4 days ago. This movie featured the majority of the things that I hate to see in movies. Most importantly, that the action scenes are too dark to know what's going on. The idea of EMPs should be erased from the lexicon of knowledge that movie makers possess, as it gives them an excuse to not provide enough light to see anything. They killed off Cranston's character, which I suppose made sense for the plot that they went with, but they killed the movie at the same time. The entire rest of it was just a giant blur of military action. Yeah, this reviewer's making an excellent point. We were so far along in the movie and invested in Bryan Cranston's character that when you killed him off, you killed off a lot of our emotional investment in the film. We hadn't, compared to what we got with Bryan Cranston's son, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson. Not only is Aaron Taylor Johnson like an unknown to me, and I actually had to look up his name because I hadn't seen him in anything remarkable. I think even to this day, he's relatively unknown as an actor, and he's not somebody that you can just drop in there and replace Bryan Cranston and you're going to get we're going to keep our emotional investment. I think that was a big mistake. Maybe this was supposed to be his breakout action role. But if that's true, they failed on that too, because I can tell you that at one scene in which this son of Bryan Cranston's scientist character, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, he's trying to protect a Japanese kid in a dangling subway train car, or a train car that's dangling from a tall height. And it kind of lets him be an action hero, but then right when he could have been an action hero, the film just cuts to a scene with him showing up somewhere else later in Hawaii, and he has somehow gotten out of that situation, and he's gotten the little kid out of the situation too. So he's actually done the action hero type of stuff, but it didn't show it on screen. It just cut to a later position in the movie, and we're just supposed to assume that he's an action hero because somehow he got out of that situation, but we never saw him get out of that situation. That was either cut from the film because of the running time, or it was that they just didn't have the budget to show us that, so they just hand-waved it away and said, yeah, he saved the kid, and somehow they got out of that train car that was, dangling, and their lives were in danger. Don't ask us how, but somehow he got out of it, so just don't worry about it. And that's the kind of stuff that this movie did. It's a really bad way to show us that we should care about this action hero, to just like tell us what he's doing but not show us. This is that old, show, don't tell, that writing teachers will teach their students. Many people have heard this 1,000 times in English class, in writing courses, but it applies to movies too. Don't tell us, show us. That's the point of the movie. If you don't have the budget to show us, just don't put that in the movie. that's probably the easiest way to go about it. Don't just cheap out and have somebody in a cliffhanger and then cut to 10 minutes later and they've somehow escaped it. That's not going to work out. That's not how you keep your audience involved in your story. But before I get too diverted on that, let's move along and find another review. We've got a 2.5-star review from December 14th, 2019, which makes this, it makes this about 10 days old. 9 days old. The movie did great with Godzilla, but most of the things are bad, especially the screen time with Godzilla. Yeah, but most of Godzilla that we saw was just his gigantic fins poking out of the ocean waves and, moving through the water, like shark fins moving through the water, gigantic ones. Not real exciting. There was like 2 or 3 minutes of actual Godzilla action where he's standing there or walking around and you can actually see him all in the frame. And mind you, you can only see him in the frame in totality during a fight sequence that's very dark, so you can't really tell what's going on or what he's fighting. I mean, yes, you can see these gigantic monsters fighting each other in the distance, but there's so much darkness going on that you're kind of like, you're not focused on that. You're on these human characters as they kind of move in front of that. And so you barely get all of this in the frame, and you can kind of see the monsters punching each other or hitting each other in the distance, but it's very dark, and you get very little of Godzilla. Most of it, like I said, is just his gigantic fins floating through the water. And there are problems with that too. There are some big logical problems with the way they showed Godzilla swimming through the ocean. They kind of make fools out of the U.S. Navy, and U.S. Navy personnel are shown to be incompetent on several occasions, all the way up to admiral level. Fighter pilots are shown to be incompetent. Scientists that their careers, I mean, they've had long careers in whatever field they're in science, they're shown to be incompetent. I mean, there's a lot of incompetence here that has to be there for this plot to work, and it just gets real tiring. If you're older than 8 or 12, no older than 12, after 20 minutes into this movie, you're kind of disgusted at all the incompetence. But maybe if you're 12-year-old age or younger, you don't notice this, at least on the first viewing, because, it's just a monster movie, right? So you can't take it serious. You're not supposed to have competent scientists or naval commanders or anything. So 3 stars, December 7, 2019. I don't like that a 6 out of 10 is defined as it passed the time on this site. I think this movie was above average. The mere glimpses we get of Godzilla for most of the runtime are great for building up suspense. No, there's a point where you can say you're building up suspense by keeping the monsters a little bit mysterious and not completely on the screen. But when you're like 45 minutes into this and you're still getting monster glimpses like this, I'm sorry, that's just a fail. That's not suspenseful at all. It's just obvious that you don't want to show us the flaws with your monster designs or your CGI or whatnot. Let's move on. November 5th, 3 stars. Big, thrilling, and okay characters. Godzilla sets up the monsterverse while failing in giving it an interesting story. Speaking of the monsterverse, I noticed that the big secretive corporation or quasi-government corporate group that tracks and contains these monsters and deals with these monsters, that's known as Monarch. And I noticed that this is definitely connected to the Kong or Skull Island Kong movie, because that's the same thing shown. It is this corporation called Monarch. And also this film opens in a similar fashion to the way that Kong or Skull Island opens. Skull Island opens with like, a retro flashback look at the space age starting and satellites zooming around the Earth and different events happening in history to take us into the late 60s. And then, or early 70s, and then this movie starts very similarly, and it kind of takes us from World War II up to the modern day, or, showing us the same kind of old newsreels, and it takes us up into the point in which an atomic bomb is dropped on, I'm guessing it's Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific, because there's a connection there between the atomic bombs tested in the South Pacific and the appearance of Godzilla. These monsters all feed on radiation, for example. And so the opening of this movie and the opening of the Skull Island movie are very similar, and it features the same monarch-type corporation, government corporation group. And so, yes, these are definitely set in the same monster verse. Unfortunately, I can say that Skull Island is a superior movie. It's more interesting, has a shorter runtime, and it's so much more effective. It's not perfect by any means, but I found it much more enjoyable than this. In fact, I wouldn't even sit through this movie twice. It's just too boring and too illogical, whereas Skull Island, I've seen it twice, and I could probably tolerate it a third time, and I wouldn't mind it. So that tells you this movie with the bigger budget that came before Skull Island, this isn't the one, this isn't the one to hang your franchise on. That's for sure. October 18, 1.5 stars. Godzilla wasn't shown very often, and the battle in San Francisco was too dark to see what's going on. Yeah, exactly. San Francisco was in the middle of the afternoon, early morning afternoon. All of a sudden, when the monsters show up, it gets dark. It's still daytime, but it's very dark all of a sudden, like cloudy and misty and dark. And then, boom, a few minutes later, we're in nighttime, total pitch darkness. And conveniently, when the monsters show up, there's power outages, right? So it gets even darker than it would be on a normal night in San Francisco. So that's more of a way to keep the monster effects covered up. Yes, it's very obvious. 2 stars, October 15. Too little monster action and a human story that fails to really connect. Feels like a drama with some background disaster scenes. That's exactly right. But the drama isn't even the biggest flaw here. Yes, it's boring. But I think the biggest flaw, again, is just the logic. A lot of logical fails. People doing things that make no sense, independent of the drama that doesn't feel authentic. For example, I've got quite a list here. Let's just go off my list real quick here. At the beginning, at the opening scene, Cranston and his wife, they work at a Japanese nuclear power plant. The wife is killed in a very kind of a setup way that we've seen done many ways in different films. We've seen done many times in different films in a very similar way. She's just, he has to make the choice to seal her off in an irradiated and deadly section of the plant when the disaster strikes. And it's at the last minute. He has to close the door on her and watch her die. Yes, we've seen this a million times in movies, and that's why it's not completely effective for somebody like me that's just seen this done too many times. But for a kid, for a teenager that hasn't seen too much of this, it might be effective. It might keep them invested. And yet it's still kind of a logical fail on top of it. It's set up where she's running down a long, long, long corridor that looks like it's too long to even be a real corridor in this nuclear power plant. And there's this wall of radioactive steam that's chasing her and her fellow colleagues or scientists or plant worker colleagues. And of course, they can always just run a little bit faster than this exploding wall of steam. Well, in the real world, that steam is going to shoot through there at hundreds of miles an hour. You're not going to just be able to keep up with it on foot and then trip and fall and then pick yourself up and then just still keep ahead of it. It doesn't work like that. But this movie has a lot of that type of stuff going on. And from the opening scene, it's doing that. And I could kind of forgive it in that one scene, but it keeps doing stuff like that. There's an entire section of Japan, a major city that's been quarantined, and ever since that nuclear disaster, it's a no-go zone. It is said to the public at large that this city is just too irradiated. The radiation's deadly, so don't go in there, and it's against the law to actually go in there. But of course, the government's lying. There's no radiation. It's safe to go in there. The government is just keeping it sealed off because there's a gigantic monster cocoon in there, and it's feeding off the remains of the nuclear reactors that were there before the plant explosion. Okay, fine. But the scientists there, they've obviously been studying it for, well, at least 15 years. And yet, when Bryan Cranston's character shows up, he shows up and just trespasses into the place. All of a sudden, at that point, the scientists start having problems with the cocoon, and the cocoon is awakening, and it's about to burst out. The monster's about to burst out. And the scientists act like after they've been studying this for 15 years that they don't know anything about it or why there's a monster inside, and they're surprised a monster's coming out of it. And they actually need Bryan Cranston's expertise to tell them what's going on. But they've been studying this for 15 years, and he hadn't been studying it at all. He was just at the plant when the initial catastrophe happened. And it's shown that he's collected some kind of data on old zip drive cartridges from 1998 or 99 that somehow managed to survive after being left out in the open environment for 15 years in a wrecked house. Now, these scientists just need the data on these old zip cartridges, these old zip drive cartridges. Like, let's just say that somehow the data on these 15-year-old data cartridges survived. Let's just hand wave that away and say they did, exposed to the elements and rain and temperature. Now, let's say that data was good and Bryan Cranston retrieved it. Why would these scientists that have been studying this monster cocoon for 15 years, the most brilliant scientists in the world working for this monarch group, why would they need Bryan Cranston, who hasn't worked as a scientist in, I don't know, 15 years, and he's also discredited, and he's also mentally crazy, and he doesn't know shit about shit, or even that there's a monster cocoon in there. They need his expertise to, like, show them this data. I'm sorry, but this is completely illogical, and it's just contrived to make the plot work. And the scientists, after the scientists' reaction to the monster coming out of the cocoon is just one of total surprise, where people are just getting killed because they're taken by surprise and they had no setup. Like, they know they're dealing with a monster cocoon, and yet they act like they didn't know what was going to happen when a giant monster come out. They're just like running around with like chickens with their heads cut off. Excuse me, you're not prepared for this giant monster to come out? I mean, this whole thing is just stupid. I could go on and on and on, but it gets worse and worse from this point on. Everything else in the movie is this dumb. And at one point, the U.S. Navy is so dumb, they're actually following Godzilla across the ocean, and their naval vessels, their destroyers, their aircraft carriers, etc., are just tracking right along Godzilla's back fins, his dorsal fins, like within like 40 yards of him. Like, oh, there's no danger in that. There's no danger in that at all. Just go ahead and have your entire naval group just like flank both sides of Godzilla swimming. Like, there's no problem. If he rolls over the wrong way, you're not going to have a problem or anything. It's completely stupid, and it shows the Navy is completely incompetent. Anyway, let's move on. What do we have here? 2.5 stars, October 5. During the second half of the movie, I just couldn't wait for it to finish. This is a very bad reboot, in my opinion. Although this revival of the iconic Japanese monster delivers some very good-looking blockbuster CGI, the characters are too thinly written, and the flick just becomes tedious and boring after a while. They should have maybe shortened the time. It stays faithful to the original source material, all while being a highly Americanized version and adapted for its time. But honestly, this is far from, and I'll leave that to your imagination what it's far from. It's far from good, that's for sure. There's some more. I didn't get to finish my logical fails with the Navy. The Navy's so incompetent that they decided that the best way to fight off the monsters is to bring them all to San Francisco and then drop a gigantic thermonuclear bomb or 2 or 3 or 4 on top of them. Oh yeah, no problem. I guess they don't mind wiping out most of San Francisco and the Bay Area. That's the brilliant plan. And when another character in the movie, a Japanese character, a scientist, tries to tell the Admiral that this isn't the best plan, the Admiral just tells him, well, you know, that's the best we've got, and tells him to basically shut up. So the Navy's incompetent. This naval admiral, he's just willing to wipe out San Francisco. Really? You couldn't, like, lure them out into the ocean and drop the bomb there or anywhere else? You had to like bring them to San Francisco. That was your big plan, and then drop nuclear bombs on them. Oh, that's just brilliant. And then the naval admiral, believe it or not, there's a scene in which he's in his ready room or his briefing room, whatever it is, and some video on a screen shows him that, you know, the evacuation of San Francisco isn't going too well. There's a bunch of school buses blocked up on the Golden Gate Bridge and etc. It's chaos. And then he complains that, you know, those school buses are holding up their plan. The school buses are holding up his plan. Not the rest of San Francisco that's still packed with people trying to get out, but just those particular school buses that are on the Golden Gate Bridge. They're just stopping him from pushing the button on this whole thing. I'm like, what? Okay. Okay, so let's move on. 3 stars, better than the sequel, but still forgettable. Not sure what the sequel is, but it's probably just as bad, I would imagine. 2.5 stars, September 29th. This movie was pretty alright. It was boring at times, but the third act, oh, that was great. But the first and second act was very disappointing. This gets a C+. Yeah, this is from somebody that just wanted to see monsters battling. The first and second acts are a lot of just drama between humans, just glimpses, small tastes of the monsters. When you get to the third act, though, yeah, you get monsters, but it's so illogical and stupid. At one point, one of the monsters goes to the Yucca Mountain nuclear waste repository in Nevada, and he breaks it open from the side of a hill and just breaks it open and then wanders into Las Vegas, and Las Vegas is shown to be right outside Yucca Flats, or right outside Yucca Mountain, and it's so stupid and cheesy and ridiculous, and all for the sake of having the monsters shown destroying some casinos, and it is really bad. Like, it's logically flawed in every way. It wouldn't even work in a comic book. It's so damn stupid. But let's move on. Going to another page. 2.5 stars, September 23rd, 2019. I don't know. This American adaptation of Godzilla isn't that good. The story is somewhat off and boring. The characters have little to no development or expression, and the monsters don't appear until almost an hour into the movie. I'll give you this. This movie is not terrible, unlike the crappy 1998 reimagining. I think that's the one with Matthew Broderick. But let's continue. It's just not what I'm looking for as a hardcore Godzilla fan. The only actual good sequence in this movie are when Godzilla and the Mutos fight in San Francisco, but when they do, it's in complete darkness. Yeah, I'm not lying. As soon as they start fighting, it just becomes nighttime, and even when it wasn't nighttime, it's all misty and gray and dark for some reason in the middle of the day. Pretty obvious that they just didn't have any confidence in their CGI monsters. But let's look at some more fails here. Let's see here. Why are the scientists surprised that the monster cocoon, when it hatches, why are the scientists running around getting killed by a monster as though they didn't know a monster was going to come out of a monster cocoon? And they've been studying this for 15 years. Doing what? I don't know. What they've been doing in these 15 years, except for sipping coffee and looking at it through a window of a tower, I don't know. Yeah, okay. If Bryan Cranston's scientist character knew so much, he had such expertise, such relevant data that those scientists needed to study this monster cocoon, why did they wait until he showed up trespassing one day? Why didn't they just bring him on board the team like 15 years earlier? Explain that one. He wasn't in hiding. He didn't go underground after the nuclear accident and go into hiding. No, he was just living in a crappy house full of junk in Japan somewhere. But they only needed him after he showed up and he trespassed into their restricted zone. And he had such valuable data to give them, and they knew he did. And that's why at one point they even had a special briefing for his son. After he's killed, he's removed from the story. For some reason, his son, who doesn't know shit from shit and is just like an off-duty military lieutenant, I guess, what he has to do with anything, I don't know. From the scientist's point of view, what good is he? They decide to brief him up and ask him all these questions about what he knows about things just because he's this guy's son. That doesn't work out too well. So they send him off. These scientists decide he doesn't really know anything, which I'm not sure why it took them so long after this long, drawn-out briefing on what their monarch organization does. Of course, this briefing is actually to tell the audience what they're doing. This is all meant to not tell him, but tell the audience, to deliver this big, huge dump of exposition. And there's a lot of that in this movie, people explaining things they should already know so that the audience will know. So after the scientists decide that the son of Bryan Cranston, scientist, doesn't really know anything, and they decide to send him back to the United States, what does the Navy do? Does the Navy, get him on aboard a flight from Tokyo back to the U.S.? maybe making a stop along the way. No, it doesn't. The Navy decides to use a helicopter to transport him from off the coast of Japan all the way to Hawaii on a helicopter. And then when he gets to Hawaii, he's supposed to get a flight back to the United States. First of all, the helicopter they're using in this film doesn't have a range that will get you from Japan to Hawaii, and there is no such helicopter in the Navy's possession that I'm aware of that you can fly from the deck of a carrier off the coast of Japan, and then you're going to fly it all the way to Hawaii without refueling somewhere. You're just going to fly that on you're going to make a short flight there. So anyway, in the movie it shows this is a very short flight to Hawaii, and then he's expected there to get a flight to the U.S., to the mainland from Hawaii. Nothing about that makes any sense. It doesn't make any sense from the military's point of view. It doesn't make any sense from this off-duty lieutenant's point of view. Why would he want to fly to Hawaii in a slow-ass helicopter, even if it did have the range, and then catch a flight? Why didn't he just go to the airport in Tokyo and catch a flight? This whole movie does stuff like this all the way from start to finish. So I just thought I'd leave that there. Let's move on. 3 stars, needed more Godzilla. 2.5 stars, not enough Godzilla. By far, human side plot, no one paid to see, designed to save money. So they're saying, yeah, we didn't want to see all this human contrived drama. We wanted to see monsters, and obviously they didn't have the budget to give us the monsters. Very well said, very short, bad grammar, but said very well. Here's one, August 29th, 2019, 2.5 stars. It had so many good people in it, emoting left and right, but the plot was confusing and convoluted. I don't understand why the mega corporations making these films can afford to spend hundreds of millions on the spectacle but can't afford a decent plot. That's a good point. I don't know how much money was spent on this movie, but according to Rotten Tomatoes, this had it brought in $173 million at the box office. So, you know, you can say that maybe at least that much was spent, probably, because I don't recall this being a big profitable movie. In fact, I think I heard that this didn't make a profit. So let's just say they spent let's be generous and say they spent $173 million. Yeah, how come they couldn't have a decent plot? Like, what part of decent writing costs like more than $170 million? No, there's nothing. There's no budget constraint on the actual script. It's just they're just goddamn lazy. They're so damn lazy they just figured just put the monsters together in the cheapest way and get those butts into those theater seats, and that'll be enough. But yeah, I think this lost money, so that didn't work out too well either. Let's go down. 1.5 stars, August 12th. I was amazed to see so much positive feedback for such a fundamentally flawed film. Whereas you'd expect the suspension of disbelief to be precariously balanced on the activities of the monsters, it's the amazing happenstance of Taylor Johnson's journey that kills this movie dead. Yes, the leading light in an action adventure is expected to face many trials, yet somehow this character, whose name I care not to remember, yeah, I don't remember it either, stumbles across key moments in Japan, Hawaii, and San Francisco. Yeah, this character, this lieutenant, who's said to be a bomb or ordnance disposal expert, he not only stumbles into all the action in Japan, Hawaii, and San Francisco, but when he asks the military to let him escort a nuclear weapon on a train from somewhere else in the country to San Francisco, they just decide to let him on board because they say as an ordnance or bomb disposal guy, he has the expertise they need. Really? They're just going to let him jump on a train with a nuclear missile on the flatbed, and nobody has a problem with any of this. And every time he meets other military personnel that have nothing to do with him, everybody, he just tells them he's in civilian clothes, dressed no differently than some guy at Walmart, and he just tells them, well, I'm Lieutenant so-and-so, and then they just stop what they're doing and like do what he says and give him all the assistance he needs. These military people that he just randomly stops in different locations, and they let him go along with the nuclear weapons, and every time the monsters are there fighting, he's somehow involved. He somehow survives it all and is there all the way to the end to live and fight all the way to the end, and as some big hero. but it is completely boring. You see him doing all this stuff, surviving all this stuff, and you're just like, wow, I need to fast forward through this. And yeah, I did fast forward some of the action because I couldn't just sit through it all. It was just too long and boring, but I could see what was going on. So you didn't miss anything. 2 stars, August 9. Again, I find myself only commending the visual effects team behind this movie. Do I remember any of the characters? No. Do I even remember Godzilla fighting? I think he showed up towards the end of the film for a few seconds. Yeah, you could vaguely see him fighting. It was kind of dark, and you could see him swinging his arms at something in the background, and you saw his breath weapon once or twice, but you never got him all in frame. You could just kind of see it in the background behind a lot of other stuff going on. And the only actual shots of Godzilla, like I said, he's just swimming under, mostly covered by water. There's a couple of shots of him at the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge, but he's not fighting. He's just kind of like standing up out of the water. And then it gets real dark before he starts fighting, and you can't see anything. 3 stars, not great, not too bad. 2 stars, max. I'm talking it down as I go. It's like I'm wanting to say 1.5 stars, but let's say 2. I'm feeling generous. July 29, 2.5 stars. Seemed choppy and incomplete most of the time. The use of the characters were often wasted on random events. Let's take a look at my list here so I don't forget any real big time fails. We've got, yeah, why wasn't Cranston scientist brought in if he knew so much earlier? Yeah, the helicopter flight from Japan to Hawaii. Yeah, that's believable. Let's see. Yep, there's a lot of extras in Hawaii that happen to look like the same extras in the scenes from Japan. In other words, they are. So basically, you have a version of Hawaii that kind of looks like you have a population from Japan. It's not believable. It throws you out of the scene. Oh yeah, helicopters and jets, Navy and Army, I'm assuming, they're all incompetent. Like the helicopter pilots are incompetent. They don't know how to fly their helicopters, get themselves killed very easily. And the actually, it looks like it's F-22 pilots. Yeah, they can't seem to shoot straight. Like with all this modern avionics, it should be easy for them to hit these giant monsters, and yet they just can't do so. They can't, and when they actually get their second, third chances to do so, the monsters find a way to disable their, swat them down or use some kind of radioactive aura weapon to disable them. But they had shots earlier. It's just for the sake of the plot. They just have to be incompetent, and their long-range weapons just don't work. Oh, and satellites aren't a thing either. Satellites in 2014, they're not capable of tracking these giant monsters either. And oh, I forgot to mention, this was the cherry on top of it all. At one part of the film, there's an actual Russian nuclear submarine that's been taken out of the ocean by a flying monster and thrown onto the land. And that's not the biggest fail. The biggest fail is showing that submarine hanging from trees. In other words, this gigantic Russian nuclear submarine is just hanging from a bunch of trees in the jungle. Yeah, okay. The movie expects you to take that 100% seriously and find that fascinating, and my God, that's incredible. Did you see that nuclear submarine hanging from those trees? That's incredible. That's incredible. Look what the monsters did. It's incredible. I can't believe what I saw. Yeah. Wow. Let's see. Yeah, Navy ships that are so confident that they just swim right, they just steam along right next to Godzilla, no problem. That's real safe. The Yucca Mountain scene where a monster comes along and just scoops out the side of Yucca Mountain, takes away, eats the nuclear waste, and then just like walks a couple of miles to Las Vegas. The boring drama, it doesn't stop. Yeah, and the boring action, the action gets boring too, and that doesn't stop. and you just want to fast forward. And the gray dim color of the monsters. Yeah, even during the daytime, if monsters have to fight, mysteriously, like this bright day, it turns into this cloudy, dark gray, like, you know, a storm front moved in and you can't see anything. And then, conveniently, a few minutes later, the sun goes down very rapidly. Like, the sun sets in this world faster than you can imagine. You don't even get a sunset, a proper sunset. It's just like day, and then all of a sudden, boom, we're in pitch dark now. It's totally in the middle of the night. Yeah, I could go on forever. I had a lot of notes, but a lot of that was already covered from other people reminding me in the reviews. And, you know, this is just wanting me to, like, bring this even below 2 stars. And I kind of want to bring it down to a star. I've actually talked myself down during this whole review, which doesn't even happen a lot, but it happened this time. So I'm saying maybe 1 star would be fair on this. Now, you get these critics, 75% fresh. I don't know if they're a fan of the director, they're a fan of monsters. I don't know what happened here, but do not believe that 75% certified fresh. You're going to go into this, if you're not 12 or under, you're going to be shaking your head at that number. Trust me, don't believe it. 66% on the audience score. How is that not like 36%? I just don't know, because I think 36% would be fair. I'm not kidding. See it for yourself. I believe this is running on HBO right now, as of December 2019. So don't take my word for it. Go check it out. Maybe you can tell me why these critics gave this 75% fresh. Wow. I have no words for that. But I will tell you one thing. I will see you on the next episode of Rotten Reviews.